In July of 1962, I left Fort Benning. I'd completed the career course, completed Pathfinder School, and I left behind my girlfriend, Emily. I was assigned to Fort Campbell, Kentucky, and I reported in at Fort Campbell, Kentucky to the 101st Airborne Division. And the division assigned me to the 506 Battle Group. And the 506 later became famous because of a book called The Band of Brothers. But at the time I was there, that book had not been written. But I became the S3, Assistant S3 initially, and the division was getting ready to go on one of the big operations that were held across the states of North Carolina and South Carolina. And we left Fort Campbell going on that. I was Assistant 3, as I said. We jumped in. I remember hanging in the chute and looking out and seeing the Darlington Raceway, and not too far away. And I landed in a watermelon patch, and I don't remember much about the maneuvering. I was on the staff, and I worked with the S3 since I was the assistant. But really what I had come to Fort Campbell to do was to become a company commander. When we came back from that exercise, the next month, I became the company commander of C Company of the 506 Battle Group. The battle group was, at that time, the Pentomic organization. We had 5 battle groups. 5 companies were a part of each battle group, as well as a mortar battery and the headquarters and so forth. So I took over that company, and in about September of that year, we were alerted to problems in Oxford, Mississippi. And this was the integration of the University of Mississippi. And there had been a situation, several people had been killed on a Sunday night. And we were alerted and moved all night long, drove all night long in a convoy, just my company by itself, in a convoy down to Oxford, Mississippi. Other companies were traveling also on different routes or at different times along that route. The Kennedys had alerted all of the 82nd and all of the 101st Airborne divisions to come into that area, and we had far too many troops. And I was told to become a reserve and to move to the Memphis Naval Air Station. And I came in the morning. The troops were fed breakfast. We had a mess truck, and the cooks cooked the breakfast, and then we moved out later in the day to the Memphis Naval Air Station. And we remained at the Naval Air Station for about a week. We were there because they wanted us to be available to return to Oxford, Mississippi. James Meredith entered the school that Monday, and there were no events, and the Kennedys were telling the governor of Mississippi that the segregation had to stop. And so we stayed there, and then things were quiet after 1 week. And I moved to company, and we moved back to Fort Campbell. I might say that airborne soldiers are famous for, on the weekends, having the ability to party pretty well. My troops had done so, and they were not in very good condition on Sunday night. Thank goodness it wasn't Saturday night that we had to move, but on Sunday night we moved. But they were still in difficult times getting there. I remember that as we moved from Oxford toward the Memphis Naval Air Station, people on the side of the road would just glare at us as we passed. We had loads of guys, but they just hated the feds having come in, and they'd glare at us. We went to a small town, and this was a Monday afternoon. There was a lady that was all dressed up, waiting to come across the street, and maybe shopping or something. In those days, the ladies would dress when they went into town. And so she was there waiting to come across, and I thought this would be a good time to perhaps make the town folk feel better about the troops. And so I stopped the convoy, and I told the driver to stop, and I touched the brim of my hat, tipping my hat to the lady, and I signaled her to go ahead and cross, and we'd stopped the whole convoy for her. And she didn't cross, she didn't like us, and she gave me the finger. And so I quickly told the driver, let's go, let's go. And so we moved on to Memphis Naval Air Station. When we returned to Fort Campbell after the situation in Mississippi, I remember that a friend of mine, Milt Mathis, came to my company, and he said, Bob, I'm really upset about something. And I asked him what, and he said, when we got to Memphis, my company was in the middle of town, and they took all the white soldiers out of my company and put them under a white commander, and they gave me all the black soldiers, and we went to the stadium, and there we stayed, and only the white soldiers were allowed to be in contact and to be with their units in Mississippi. I remember he was very upset about it, and he wanted something done. His battle group commander had agreed that that was not the right thing to do. We were there to integrate. I remember later in life, I still know Milt. Milt lives in Washington, D.C., and a few years ago, I found an article about exactly that subject, the segregation of the units while they were there. And this was an order from Robert and John Kennedy, I suspect just to sort of keep things calmer in the town of Oxford. They did that, but that was certainly an unusual order for us, and Milt really appreciated me sending me an article. It wasn't long after we left Mississippi and came back, and were getting back in order again, that the Cuban Missile Crisis became quite an issue. And I was reading a lot about it in the newspapers, and we had been semi-alerted. We knew that we might have a role in perhaps an invasion of Cuba, but nothing much had been said. Then I saw a lot of lights in the gymnasium and guards on the doors, and I knew something was being planned there. And one afternoon I was called with the other company commanders to go to the gym, and there on the wall of the gym was a gigantic map of Cuba. It must have been 60 or 70 feet long, and we were given an order about our plans. We would go to Florida, Marshall, and then jump into Cuba, and we were given the drop zones that we would drop on and so forth, and we were to come back the next day and back brief the battle group commander on how we planned to execute our plans. So I did that, went back briefed on how I planned to execute things, and then it was my turn to have my platoon leaders there. And we scheduled times that each company could come in, and I came in, gave them the orders of exactly where we were to go into, where we were to assemble, and so forth. And the map was extremely large, as I said, so you could see in great detail the field that we were going to drop into. The bad thing about it, I remember that it was a sugar cane field, and the sugar cane had just been cut. And when they cut that with a large knife, it leaves a very sharp edge, and we had to warn the troops about that, and they were very concerned trying to figure ways that they could protect themselves as they had to drop into the drop zone with these sugar cane. Well, we stayed ready to jump for, I suspect, a couple of weeks, and then the thing eased off. There's a lot of marshalling areas all set up in Florida. In fact, they used to say that Florida almost sank from the military equipment that was carried down there for the invasion of Cuba. We went down. I went down with my company. We marshaled just as if we were going to Cuba, but instead we turned around and came back, flew up to Fort Campbell and dropped on the drop zone at Fort Campbell, and then marshaled, and then we were released. I did that twice because I did it once with my company as company commander, and then I did it once as the umpire of another company that was dropped in, that was exercising the plan, but coming back and dropping in. I think some of the companies came back up from Florida and dropped into Fort Bragg rather than our place. Most of my drops were at Fort Campbell. And I remember on one of the occasions that I dropped in, it was on Thanksgiving Day, and the first sergeant, Ben Seago, knew I was been out, and he came out. He brought Thanksgiving lunch for me, my driver, and we had Thanksgiving lunch. The company had lunch before that, and then they brought that out to me. I really appreciated him thinking of it. I trained a lot with my company at Fort Campbell, and I felt like they were really in good shape. We jumped a lot, we trained a lot, and it was fun to take the company out to the end of the post and then to come back in maneuvering as we did. I could tell the company that we were going to stop off to the side of the road and rest for about 10 minutes, and it was going to happen in 1 minute. And I'd have a countdown, and just as we got to 1 minute, everybody left the road. The road was completely bare, when, in fact, before that, it had been almost a half mile long of troops. We would rest, and then we'd do the same thing. Give them a countdown, 1 minute, come back on the road. Everybody would step up and start moving out. We didn't have any congestion. We were really good at it. And we also could maneuver, moving from area to area, give them an order, set up a defensive position, attack a certain hill or position. And so we became very proficient in our operation. While I was at Fort Campbell, of course, the war in Vietnam was beginning. And in fact, when I was in the advanced course before this, they had thought at one time they needed a lot of captains and that they would just take the whole advanced class, 400 of us, and send us to Vietnam. Well, they did not execute that plan. They did individually. When I was coming near to my time of ending as company commander, I wrote a letter to Department of Army and said that I would like to be assigned to Vietnam on my next assignment. I had the feeling the thing was about to get over and I might miss out on it, so I thought I would volunteer. I got a letter back saying they had all the captains that they needed at this time, and they appreciated my offer. Well, 2 months later, I got orders to Vietnam. While I was at Fort Campbell, I tried to keep in touch a lot with Emily, and we talked by phone a lot, and I wrote letters a lot, and I went down to Fort Benning whenever I could find a weekend. I remember one of the weekends, the Fort Campbell football team was playing the Fort Benning football team. So I flew on the plane with the football team down there, and they were going to spend the night. And so Emily came out to the post, met me. We had a good time together. I had a motel there in town. I think maybe she'd loaned me her car to get to the motel, left her at her house, and then came back the next day. She took me back out to Fort Benning, but she also came to Fort Campbell at one time. And I remember she came up on the train, and when she got off the train in Nashville, I met her in Nashville, she looked so tired, and I right away took her to her motel room and left her there and went on back to the post. It was in the town nearby, and because I knew she was just absolutely exhausted. While there also, I learned that a lieutenant in D Company next to me, his family was in the jewelry business, and I asked him how much it would cost me to get a diamond ring, an engagement ring, and he said $300. And I thought I could probably scrape together that much, but that was really a strain to get $300 together. I got the money, I paid him, and on one of those occasions, I gave the engagement ring to Emily, and she wore it back to work the next time. Well, some of my buddies there knew Emily, guys I'd known in the 4th Armored Division, and they saw the ring and asked, "Who in the world are you engaged to?" And she said, "A fellow by the name of Bob Crittenden." And they knew me. I'd known him at the 4th Armored Division, and they were excited about it and calling other people up. "See that ring? Who gave it to? Who do you think gave it to her?" "Bob Crittenden." So anyway, she had a lot of attention as a result of getting that ring. After I left Fort Campbell and went to the MATA course, it was a Special Forces course that trained advisors and how to be advisors. We had some language. We learned a lot about the country of Vietnam. We learned about how to advise and how to deal with the Vietnamese. And the course probably was about 6 weeks long. I don't remember exactly, but I had left Campbell, moved to Fort Bragg, took the course, but there were a couple of guys in the class that were from Fort Benning, and they would try to go home to their families every other weekend or so. And I rode with them twice, I believe, while I was at Fort Bragg to see Emily. One of the big things in my life happened right at the end of my Fort Campbell tour. I wrote a letter to Emily and asked her if she would marry me. And I didn't get a letter back. I didn't get an answer, so I sort of wondered what the story was. I called her and I said, "Did you get a letter from me?" And she said, "Yes, she did." And I said, "Well, what do you think about my idea of getting married before I go to Vietnam?" And she said, "I think that would be wonderful." And so we decided to get married. Just after I finished MATA course, I had time off before my orders moved me to Vietnam, and so we took that time and got married at her mom's church, her church, there in Columbus. And there's a lot about this in the scrapbook, one of the scrapbooks that tells about what we did, where we went on our honeymoon, all of the things we did. But we had a big trip. One of the big events was staying at the Williamsburg Inn. It's a very expensive, very classy place, and I'd been there as a kid with my mom and dad one time, not overnight, just in the restaurant. And the quote says that people that go to the Williamsburg Inn are the newlyweds and the nearly dead. We went there and we enjoyed that, as well as many other events. Went to New York City. Anyway, the scrapbook contains all the information on that. After the honeymoon, we were in Richmond, and I was going to give him a car to Barry while he was at Virginia Tech. So we left Richmond, drove to Virginia Tech, spent the night, picked him up the next day, and then we drove all day long down to Columbus. He took us back, and then he took my car. It was during that trip that John Kennedy was assassinated. So we were listening to the radio all the way down, and when I got down to Columbus, I watched on TV all of the events going on connected with the Kennedy assassination. After a few days, I left Columbus Emily and her mom took me to Atlanta Airport, and there I flew to the West Coast on my way to Vietnam.